Fourth International, From International Left Opposition to Movement for the Fourth International, by Robert J. Alexander. Leon Trotsky had hardly begun his last exile before he started efforts to bring together on an international basis his followers in various countries, while he was still living in the Soviet consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, entered into epistolary contact with some of his friends in Western and Central Europe. There was no lack of individuals and groups who were, or thought they were, loyal to the person and ideas of Leon Trotsky. These were people who had left the official communist movement at various times and under various circumstances, and there were even some who were still members of the official communist parties. Once Leon Trotsky was forced into exile, these heterogeneous people immediately turned to him for guidance, for encouragement, or for self-aggrandizement, or a combination of all these things. Alfred Rosmer, writing to Trotsky about France, might also have been describing the situation in several other countries. He observed that, quote, "Your banishment has made all of the opposition groups come out of the lethargy more or less characteristic of all of them, and all, or nearly all, present themselves as the true champions of your ideas. The great difficulty with all the opposition groups is that they find themselves apart from all action, and thus their sectarian character has been fatally accentuated." End quote. Rosmer concluded that, quote, "It is only with the establishment of a general platform that it will be possible to emerge from the present difficulties and give the opposition a cohesion indispensable for that opposition's development and action." End quote. This was exactly what Trotsky set about trying to do. The early role of the Rosmers. People from many different countries entered into correspondence with Trotsky soon after his arrival in Turkey. Some of these he had known in the past during his early exiles or during the early years of the Soviet regime. Others were people about whom he knew little. Still others had been his opponents in the past, but changing circumstances had made them allies or would-be allies of the exiled Soviet leader. During his struggle within the Soviet Party after 1923, Trotsky had relatively little contact with supporters outside of the Soviet Union. Pierre Frank has noted, quote, "The left opposition in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had not organically aligned with the different oppositions which were formed in the same years, from 1923 to 1927, with the different communist parties. These oppositions were far from having common political bases. The opposition which in different communist parties fought against the mounting bureaucratic regime and published the documents of the Soviet opposition which came into their hands had been formed during different stages of the crisis of the Communist International and its sections around different national, international problems, and they presented a heterogeneous political character. There were even in certain countries several opposition groups which were fighting one another. These groups had only the remotest relations with the Soviet opposition, and that amounted only to the exchange of publications or of documents." End quote. Pierre Frank. Under these circumstances, Trotsky turned in the first instance particularly to his old friends and comrades in arms, Alfred and Marguerite Rosmer, for advice and help. In their early letters to Trotsky in Turkey, the Rosmers tried to sort out the various oppositionist groups which existed in France. They also very early helped to put Trotsky in contact with oppositionists, with whom they themselves had been associated in Luxembourg and Belgium. In July 1929, Alfred Rosmer made a trip to Austria and Germany to meet with groups and individuals there who had proclaimed themselves to be followers of Trotsky and had had correspondence with him. He wrote to Trotsky about his impression of Landau, Frey, and other factions and individuals in Austria, and the Leninbund, Hugo Urbans, and those opposed to Urbans in Germany. One of the purposes of Rosmer's travels was to muster support for a periodical which could not only serve as an official organ of the French followers of Trotsky, but could be an official mouthpiece for the embryonic international Trotskyist movement. It could clearly put forth the ideological positions of Trotsky and differentiate them from those of other oppositionist groups, which might have thought themselves to be Trotskyists, but in fact did not hold with the ideas, which Trotsky felt were the correct positions on a wide range of issues. This publication, the first number of which appeared soon after Rosmer's return from Austria and Germany, was La Verite, or La Verite, I'm not sure. Is if you have an E, I'm gonna look it up. You know what? It's my world.
La vérité.
I thought so. La Verite. Okay. This publication, the first number of which appeared soon after Rosmer's return from Austria and Germany, was La Verite. Trotsky had confided the task of bringing out such a journal principally to Rosmer, and in the beginning at least, Rosmer had apparently hoped to have it appear in at least two languages, French and German. In fact, it appeared only in French. Trotsky himself, in a letter dated March 31st, 1929, defined the, quote, 3 classic questions which provide a decisive criterion allowing one to understand the tendencies existing in world communism, end quote. These questions were, quote, 1. The policy of the Anglo-Russian Committee. 2. The course followed in the Chinese Revolution. 3. The economic policy in the USSR, together with the theory of socialism in one country, end quote. Trotsky went on to add a characteristic observation, quote, certain comrades will be surprised perhaps that I did not mention here the question of the internal regime of the party. I act thus not to forget the issue, but quite consciously. The existing regime in the party has no importance of its own, is of no value in itself. It is a factor which derives from the policy of the party. The most heterogeneous elements have sympathy for the struggle against Stalinist bureaucracy, end quote, Trotsky. Pierre Frank has noted that, quote, in this letter and in other documents that follow shortly thereafter, Trotsky distinguished 3 fundamental currents in the Communist International, end quote. These were, said Frank, quote, A, the left opposition, which defended the fundamental political and organizational policies of Leninism advocated by the Bolshevik Leninists in the Soviet Union. B. The right opposition, oriented by the right wing of the Bolshevik Party around Bukharin and composed of groups opposed to Stalinism, not because of its fundamental policy, not on the question of socialism in one country, but more particularly because of its, quote, ultra-left, end quote, errors. In the center, the Stalinist faction, the bureaucratic wing in the service of the Kremlin, end quote. The founding meeting of the International Left Opposition. Once La Verite was being published, Leon Trotsky became increasingly impatient to have the next step taken, the establishment of an international organization which could coordinate the activities of the various national left communist groups and provide a regular means of exchanging information and ideas among them. He particularly pressed this idea on Alfred Rosmer, thus writing to Rosmer on October 13, 1929, he says, quote, I have already written you my opinion of the necessity for the Provisional Committee, or perhaps Information Bureau, a more modest and therefore wiser title, to present itself to the various groups and begin its work, end quote. He sent a draft of a circular letter calling for the establishment of such a body, suggesting that it be signed by G. Gurov, a pseudonym of Trotsky. Alfred Rosmer and the Belgian War van Overstraeten Trotsky was particularly anxious for action because of rumors that Hugo Orbáns and Maurice Paz, who had recently broken with him, were about to take a similar step. However, no action was taken at that time. 2 months later, on December 13th, Trotsky again wrote Rosmer about the issue. He commented that, quote, "The creation of an international center, however modest it may be, is very urgent for France as well as for the other countries," end quote. It was not until April 6, 1930, that the first international meeting of Trotskyists took place and the international left opposition was formally established. The French Ligue Communiste opposition, the Communist League of America, unified opposition of the German Communist Party, opposition group of the Belgian Communist Party, the Spanish opposition, the Czechoslovakian left opposition, the Hungarian Communist opposition, and the Jewish opposition group of Paris were represented by delegates at this meeting in Paris. Among those attending were Max Shachtman from the United States, Alfred Rosmer, and Pierre Neville of France. Julian Gorkin from Spain, and German Oscar Zeipold. Leon Lezoil and Adhemar Hinal from Belgium, Jan Frankel from Czechoslovakia, Zvilavsky or Zlavsky from Hungary, and Oben Miel from the Paris Jewish group. This meeting elected an international secretariat, presumably to carry on the activities of the new organization. It also agreed that there should be a bulletin issued regularly in which, quote, "the text published will be of two kinds. On the one hand will be information sent by all the groups. The other part will be discussion articles looking towards the preparation of the conference, the elaboration of a political platform," end quote. The April 6th meeting also adopted two documents. One was a short message, quote, "sending warm greetings from and testimony of close solidarity to the Bolshevik comrades imprisoned and deported, and to their exiled leader, L.D. Trotsky," end quote. The second document was, quote, "a call to the proletarians of the world," end quote. This call was the first official doctrinary and programmatic statement of international Trotskyism. It began by noting, quote, "the profound social and political crises," end quote, "developing in the various capitalist countries." It observed that, quote, "only the revolutionary movement with the proletarian party, thanks to the teachings of Marx and Lenin, lead the proletariat to its liberation, thus creating the basis of the new society which will liberate all humanity," end quote. However, the document noted that a, quote, "profound crisis presently ravages the Communist International." A substantial part of the, quote, call was devoted to this crisis. It observed that, quote, that it is, quote, quote, "is in large part a reflection of a direct consequence of the crisis which is taking place in the Russian Communist Party and in all the Soviet Union," end quote. It then developed what was to become the classic Trotskyist explanation for that crisis, quote, "principally the weakness of the Occidental proletarian movement, the Occidental proletarian revolution in the years immediately following the imperialist war. The USSR could not alone liquidate the society divided into classes or construct socialism. It could only defend the basis of a society against the whole of the capitalist world until the proletariat of the advanced capitalist countries comes to its aid," end quote. However, quote, "after the death of Lenin, after the heavy defeats suffered in Germany, in Bulgaria, and in Estonia, the Soviet Union entered a period of social and political reaction in the party and in the country as a whole. It was in that epoch that, ignoring the course of the international revolution, there was crystallized the theory of socialism in one country," end quote. The document went on to proclaim that, quote, every attempt to carry out a program of proletarian dictatorship and of liquidation of the capitalist class on the basis of the theory of socialism in one country is bound to fail, end quote. The conclusion of this part of the April 1930 document was that, quote, the international left opposition says openly to the conscious workers of the entire world that the Soviet Union, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the Communist International, the vanguard of the working class are in danger, and that the regime dominant in Russia and the International are moving towards catastrophe. All the communist militants, the revolutionary combatants, must join the left opposition to retrieve the flag of Bolshevism, end quote. This statement of the Paris meeting made it clear that they were not establishing a new international. Quite to the contrary, quote, the moral and political heritage of the International of Lenin is firmly asserted by the international left opposition. It cannot be seized from it, end quote. This point was reiterated near the end of the statement. Quote, thanks to the tradition of the Revolution of October, official communism, regardless of its enfeeblement, still brings together in many countries the most active part of the working class. This is why the opposition rejects the idea of a second party and a fourth international. It considers itself a fraction with the objective of rehabilitating the Communist International on the true basis of Marx and Lenin. For the same reasons, it can never be separated from the activity of the proletarian vanguard, end quote. Subsequent to the Paris meeting, 9 other groups expressed their support of the new international left opposition, bringing the total at that time to 17. These were the Russian opposition, the communist opposition of Austria, and the Austrian Communist Party opposition, the Communist Opposition Committee of Argentina, the Brazilian Lenin Communist Committee in exile, the Archaeo-Marxist of Greece, the Italian left fraction, and the new opposition of the Italian Communist Party and the Communist Opposition of Mexico. The April 1930 meeting established an international bureau consisting of Alfred Rosmer and Pierre Neville as Rosmer's deputy, Max Schachmann, Kurt Landau of Germany, and Austrian, Andreas Nien, and Trotsky's son, Leon Sadov, who used the pseudonym Markin. This bureau, or Markin, M-A-R-K-I-N, this bureau was largely ineffectual because Schachmann returned to the United States. Andreas Nien was soon jailed in Spain. Alfred Rosmer withdrew from Trotskyist activities later in 1930, and Sadov Markin was unable to get to Paris from Istanbul. The International Secretariat, IS, which was also named with slightly more successful. Pierre Neville was the most reliable member of the International Secretariat. Pierre Neville was at first aided by an Italian named Suso and by Aubin Mill, who in 1932 was disclosed as a Stalinist. Trotsky then relied on the Sobolevikius brothers to organize the Secretariat, but they were also Stalinist agents and quite spectacularly, quote, went over, end quote, to the Stalinist side in 1933. They were then working with Sadov, who had been able to establish his headquarters and a part of the International Secretariat in Berlin until the Hitler regime came to power. One thing the International Secretariat did succeed in doing was issuing more or less regularly the International Bulletin of the Left Opposition. It first appeared in French and English, and in early 1931 the Communist League of America Opposition announced that the English-language version of the periodical would be issued regularly under its aegis. Attempt at international organization by Trotskyist dissidents. Some of those people in various countries who had sought to join forces with Trotsky during the first year or so of his exile, but who then broke with him, also tried to establish an international organization. George Breitman has noted that, quote, in 1931 and 32, forces that had split from the international left opposition tried to put together a new international center in competition with the International Secretariat. They received tolerance and even sympathy from some of the anti-IS people still in the international left opposition. Brightman notes that, quote, the effort finally failed because the only thing the dissidents had in common was a distaste for the, quote, methods, end quote, of Trotsky and the International Secretariat, and because the main cadres of the international left opposition rallied around Trotsky and the International Secretariat in 1932. The effort to organize a kind of, quote, international Trotskyism without Trotsky, end quote, thus came to naught. Leon Trotsky's visit to Copenhagen. Trotsky never attended any of the meetings, pre-conferences, or conferences of his followers leading up to the establishment of the Fourth International, nor did he take part in the founding conference. Virtually the only time Trotsky met with a substantial number of his followers from several different countries at the same time and to exchange views with them at some length was in November 1932 in Copenhagen. Trotsky had been invited by the Social Democratic Youth Group of Denmark to come to the Danish capital and deliver a lecture on the Russian Revolution. The Social Democratic government in power at the time, to avoid political embarrassment, could not turn down this request and issued visitors' visas to Trotsky and his wife. This was in spite of official demarches, according to Trotsky himself, by Soviet embassies in both Denmark and Sweden against such action. The Danish government turned down Trotsky's request that he and his wife be allowed to stay in Denmark a few weeks beyond his lecture for medical treatment. The Soviet news agency TASS broadcast a report that during his stay in Copenhagen, Trotsky had participated in a, quote, Trotskyite International Conference, end quote. There was, in fact, no such, quote, conference. There was a small gathering of Trotsky's supporters and he explained the occasion for this. Quote, my friends in various countries of Europe were extremely worried by the campaign in the European reactionary press. They saw this campaign in connection with the recent disclosures in the left press about the terrorist act being prepared against me. Some 24 of my co-thinkers arrived from the 6 countries near Denmark. After the completely peaceful outcome of my talk, they all went home, apart from 1 or 2 who decided to accompany me back, end quote. There were 27 people in all who came to Copenhagen to meet, protect, and talk with Trotsky. These were the Germans O. Fischer, A. Grilvich, O. Hippe, H. Schneeweiss, J. Schaufmann, B. Weinberg, G. Youngklaas, E. Kohn, C. Hunter, K. Stortenbecker, 8 Frenchmen, Pierre and Denis Neville, Gerard Rosenthal, Jean Martin, Jean Meichler, Robert Buren, Raymond Molinier, and Pierre Frank, 3 Italians, Pietro Tresso, Lucien Tedeschi, and Alfonso Leonetti, Hendrik Sneevliet of the Netherlands, Jan Frankel of Czechoslovakia, Harry Wicks of Great Britain, Leon Lesoil of Belgium, and B.J. and Esther Field of the United States. The last 2 were reported as being present, quote, in a personal capacity, end quote. Although this meeting was no sense a formal conference, Rudolf Prager has noted that they, quote, amply debated the themes that would be dealt with in the, quote, 11 points, end quote, end quote. Trotsky commented when the session was over that the, quote, unforeseen improvised meeting of the 24 Bolshevik Leninists from 7 European countries will be considered an important accomplishment in the history of our international fraction, end quote. The pre-conference of February 1933. The next meeting of the international left opposition, Bolshevik-Leninists, took place in Paris from February 4th to 8, 1933. It had the peculiar designation of a, quote, pre-conference, end quote, having as it did presumably the task of preparing the ground for a full-blown conference to be held later in the year. The pre-conference of February 1933 was of peculiar importance in the history of international Trotskyism. It not only brought a reorganization of the apparatus of the group and reviewed its progress in a number of countries, but most importantly, it set forth a series of 11 points that were largely to constitute the ideological and programmatic basis of international Trotskyism for the next half-century. According to a report on the pre-conference, which appeared in La Vérité on February 16, 1933, there were delegates present at the meeting from the Russian, German, French, Belgian, Greek, Bulgarian, British, Italian, Swiss, Spanish, and American sections. In addition, quote, others sent their adherents, end quote, to the meeting. The meeting adopted several documents in addition to the 11 points. One was, quote, an appeal to the members of the German Communist Party, to the Social Democratic Workers, to the German proletariat, end quote, calling for the establishment of a united front immediately in Germany to face the menace represented by the coming of Hitler to power a few days earlier. Another document was a telegram sent to the Comintern which read, quote, in face gravity. Excuse me. Either a typo here or whatever this is. Quote, in face gravity, German situation and menaces against USSR demand urgent convocation, World Congress, Communist International, with participation, international left opposition. Invite Comintern proposed United Front to organize LSI, RILU. Yeah? Dinner is serving. All right. IFTU for Common Action, German and International Proletariat Against German Fascism for Defense of USSR, end quote. Needless to say, the Trotskyists received no answer. In addition, the pre-conference took steps which were presumably to lead both to a more efficient organization and to preparation for a full-scale world conference of the movement. It established a plenum of the organization composed of the delegates from the German, French, Belgian, Greek, and Russian sections, which would supervise a new secretariat, which was also named and would have the power to change the membership of the secretariat. Hello? In preparation for the World Conference, the pre-conference submitted the document containing the 11 points as the basis for discussion among the national sections. The sections were instructed to spend 4 weeks in such discussion and to submit thereafter any changes they might suggest. The sections were also invited to submit by April 15th other theses to be discussed at the World Meeting, which it was announced would take place in July. The conference did not actually meet until 3 years after the date it was originally scheduled. The pre-conference also sought to define as carefully as possible just who would be invited to the coming World Conference. The same document containing the 11 points noted that, quote, the last 4 years were for the international left opposition a time not only of clarification and deepening of theory, but also its cleansing of alien, sectarian, adventurous, bohemian elements without a principled position, without serious devotion to the cause, without connection with the masses, without a sense of responsibility and discipline, and for that all the more inclined to listen to the voice of careerism, end quote. As a consequence of this, the document said, quote, the proposal to call a conference with each and every group that counts itself in the left opposition, the groups of Landau and Rosmer, Monroth, Spartacus, the Weisbord group, etc., represents an attempt to turn the wheel backward and shows a complete lack of understanding of the conditions and laws of development of a revolutionary organization. The pre-conference not only rejects but also condemns such an attitude as being in radical contradiction to the organizational policies of Marxism, end quote. The 11 points. The document containing the 11 points, which summed up the position of international Trotskyism, was entitled, quote, "The International, Its Tasks and Methods," end quote. It had been completed by Trotsky in December 1932, shortly after his return to Principo from the visit to Copenhagen. 11 points were contained in a section of that document entitled Fundamental Principles of the Left Opposition. That section began by stating that, quote, "The international left opposition stands on the ground of the first four congresses of the Comintern. All the essential principles in relation to imperialism and the bourgeois state, to democracy and reformism, problems of insurrection, the dictatorship of the proletariat, on relations with the peasantry and the oppressed nations, Soviets' work in the trade unions, parliamentarism, this policy of the United Front, remain even today the highest expression of proletarian strategy in the epoch of the general crisis of capitalism," end quote. The 11 essential elements of Trotskyism were then stated. Since they included what was to remain its basic program, they are worthy of extensive quotation. 1. The independence of the proletarian party, always and under all conditions. Condemnation of the Stalinist theory of two-class, worker and peasant parties, and of the whole practice based on this theory. 2. Recognition of the international and thereby the permanent character of the proletarian revolution. Rejection of the theory of socialism in one country. 3. Recognition of the Soviet state as a workers' state in spite of the growing degeneration of the bureaucratic regime, and unconditional obligation of every worker to defend the Soviet state against imperialism as well as against international counter-revolution. Condemnation of the economic policy of the Stalinist faction, both in its stage of economic opportunism from 1923 to 1928, struggle against, quote, super-industrialization, end quote, staking all on the kulaks, as well as in its stage of economic adventurism in 1928 to 1932. Condemnation of the criminal bureaucratic legend that, quote, the Soviet state has already entered into socialism, end quote. 5. Recognition of the necessity of systematic communist work in the proletarian mass organizations, particularly in the reformist trade unions. Condemnation of the theory and practice of the Red Trade Union organization. 6. Rejection of the formula of the, quote, democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote, as a separate regime distinguished from the dictatorship of the proletariat, which wins the support of the peasant and the oppressed masses in general. Rejection of the anti-Marxist theory of the peaceful, quote, growing over, end quote, of the democratic dictatorship into the socialist one. 7. Recognition of the necessity to mobilize the masses under transitional slogans corresponding to the concrete situation in each country, and particularly under democratic slogans, insofar as it is a question of struggle against feudal relations, national oppression, or different varieties of openly imperialistic dictatorship, fascism, Bonapartism, etc. Recognition of the necessity of a developed united front policy with respect to the mass organizations of the working class, both of trade union and political character. Rejection of the theory of social fascism, of the entire practice bound up with it as serving fascism on the one hand and the social democracy on the other. 10. Differentiation of three groupings within the camp of communism: the Marxist, the centrist, the right. Recognition of the impermissibility of a political alliance with the right against centrism. Support of centrism against the class enemy. Irreconcilable and systematic struggle against centrism and its zigzag policies. Recognition of party democracy, not only in words but also in fact. Some of the 11 points were directed specifically against the third period policies of the Stalinist Comintern, the theory of social fascism, opposition to united fronts, dual unionism, and therefore became more or less moot issues once the Stalinists had changed their, quote, line, end quote. However, none of the 11 positions enunciated here was ever repudiated by Trotsky or his followers, and only the 10th was substantially modified. The points concerning the, quote, independence of the proletarian party, end quote, the, quote, permanent, end quote, nature of the revolution, recognition of the USSR as a workers' state, rejection of the idea of a, quote, democratic dictatorship of workers and peasants, end quote, and the necessity for, quote, transitional, end quote, slogans continued to be the essence of Trotskyism. Many, if not most, of the bitter internecine quarrels among the Trotskyists during the next half-century centered to a greater or lesser degree on allegations that one faction or the other was breaking either in theory or practice one or more of these doctrinal positions. What might have been regarded as a, quote, 12th point, end quote, although it was not listed as such in the document, was repudiated soon after the February 1933 meeting. This was the statement that, quote, the international left opposition regards itself as a faction of the Comintern and its separate national sections as factions of the national communist parties. This means that the left opposition does not regard the organizational regime created by the Stalinist bureaucracy as final. On the contrary, its aim is to tear the banner of Bolshevism out of the hands of the usurping bureaucracy and return the Communist International to the principles of Marx and Lenin, end quote. The August 1933 plenum. The World Conference of the International Left Opposition, planned for July 1933, never took place. However, there were two plenum meetings in May and August 1933, which marked a fundamental change in the strategic orientation of the international Trotskyist movement. They followed the evolution of Trotsky's thinking concerning the strategy which he and his followers should follow in the light of the complete collapse of the mighty German Communist Party in the face of the advent to power of the Nazis and the refusal of the Soviet leadership and the Comintern not only to recognize that they had erred in the policies they had dictated to the German party, but also, on the contrary, to continue to insist that their policies had been entirely correct. The May 1933 plenum of the International Left Opposition adopted a resolution calling, as had Trotsky, for the establishment of a new communist party in Germany. The following meeting, 3 months later, took the much more drastic step of calling for the establishment of a new international and new communist parties in every country. Two actions of the August plenum set forth this fundamental change of strategy. One was a modification of point 10 of the 11 points. Another was passage of a resolution entitled the, quote, International Opposition and the Communist International, end quote. A third move, an alteration in the name of the Trotskyist International Organization, was taken at a subsequent plenum in September 1933. According to La Vérité of September 8, 1933, the August plenum decided to change point 10, which originally had dealt with the three factions of the Comintern, to read as follows, quote, struggle for regroupment of the revolutionary forces of the world working class under the banner of internationalist communism, recognition of the necessity to create a true communist international capable of applying the principles already enumerated, end quote. The resolution, which extensively set forth the change in strategic direction, quote, the international opposition and the Communist International, end quote, first noted the earlier decision to support formation of a new Communist Party in Germany and traced the, quote, degeneration, end quote, of the Comintern and its member parties since the death of Lenin. It then proclaimed that, quote, the force of facts imposes upon us a new orientation from now on, end quote. The resolution went on, quote, we must envisage all the possibilities of rapprochement and collaboration with the revolutionary forces which, after the German catastrophe, begin to detach themselves from the influence of the Communist International, directed by the Stalinists, and of the Second International, and which orient towards a communist movement founded on the principles formulated by the First Congress of the Communist International, and upon the experience acquired in the communist movement since the death of Lenin, end quote. A major part of the resolution set forth 5 answers to the question, quote, how to constitute this new international, end quote. The first point, quote, was to consider ourselves as the embryo of the true Communist Party, to establish in each section our very extensive action program, end quote. Perhaps presaging the, quote, French turn to be shortly undertaken, this point called for, quote, directing our principal fire against the influence of the social democracy, tending to attract the workers attached to the party by real action against the bourgeoisie and its valets, end quote. The second answer to the question of how to bring about the new international called for the Trotskyists to build up counterparts of the, quote, front groups, end quote, of the Comintern, using as a specific example the International Red Aid. The third was to emphasize the point that, quote, the reconstitution of a party in the USSR and the reinforcement of the revolutionary proletariat in the world around a revolutionary international are decisive factors in the defense of the workers' state, end quote. The fourth tactical point of the resolution claimed, quote, our present forces acting as the embryo of a communist party, through their political cohesion, their success and activity in the organizations of the working class, the resulting experience can exercise an important attraction on the other currents of the workers' movement ejected from the Third or the Second International, which are evolving towards communist positions. Our attractive power will be much greater because our position as a fraction will no longer exist as a barrier between these currents and us, end quote. This part of the document went on to warn that the proposed new international would not be, quote, between the Second and Third Internationals, but rather based on the positions of the first 4 Congresses of the Comintern, quote, abandoned by the Communist International, end quote, which have been, quote, enriched by the experience of the last 10 years, end quote, and on, quote, the 11 points of the pre-conference, end quote, of the international left opposition. Finally, the document argued that, quote, with the basis of political agreements with existing groups thus defined, the left opposition must understand the historic interest represented by the international realignment of these groups currently dispersed, which, without well-defined principles, without organic links, could in the present chaos degenerate or be subjected to exterminating maneuvers of the Stalinists, end quote. Conforming to their new orientation as a group quite separate from the Comintern, the Trotskyists, September 33rd plenum decided to change the name of their organization, adopting the title Internationalist Communist League, Bolshevik-Leninists. The Declaration of the Four. In launching the idea of forming a new international, Leon Trotsky and his followers clearly thought at first in terms of the possibility of uniting under their banner a diverse group of parties which over the previous few years had broken away from either the Communist or Socialist International. The parties involved were a very, very heterogeneous group. On the one hand, there were dissident socialist parties, including the Independent Labour Party, which had just recently withdrawn from its long affiliation with the British Labour Party, and the Norwegian Labour Party, which after a short affiliation with the Comintern in the early 1920s, had maintained itself as an independent leftist social democratic organization, and with neither of which the Trotskyists wanted anything to do. There was also the Socialist Labour Party, the SAP, which had broken away from the German Social Democrats shortly before the triumph of Hitler, and had been joined by a substantial part of the German Communist right opposition. There was also the Swedish Communist Party, the only national party which in its majority had broken with the Comintern to join the right opposition, but which by 1933 was on the way to abandoning that group. Another element more or less aligned to the right opposition was the Bloque Obrero y Campesino of Spain, led by Joaquin Marin. which also maintained contacts with the Independent Labour Party, the German SAP, and similar groups. Finally, there was the two Dutch parties, the Revolutionary Socialist Party, the RSP, a dissident communist group led by Hendrik Sneevliet, I don't know how to say his name. Let's see. Oh, I can't see. And the Independent Socialist Party, SSP, which had recently broken with the Social Democrats. A number of these groups had participated in a congress in April 1932, which established an organization widely known by its German initials, IAG, International Arbeitsgemeinschaft, or, as the London Bureau, from the city where its headquarters was located. The participants in this meeting included the Independent Labour Party, the SAP, the Independent Socialist Labour Party of Poland, NSPP, the Independent Socialist Party of the Netherlands, OSP, and the Norwegian Labour Party. A subsequent meeting of the IAG in Brussels had adopted a resolution written by Boris Goldenberg of the SAP calling for the, quote, creation of a new international labor movement, end quote. To a greater or less degree, all of these groups favored establishment of a new international. However, they had vastly different concepts about the nature of such an organization and disagreed profoundly on a number of programmatic issues, particularly with regard to the Soviet Union. In retrospect, it is clear that Trotsky and his associates were excessively optimistic in thinking that all or most of these groups could be welded together in a new international under Trotsky's leadership and in conformance with his ideas. One of the decisions of the August Trotsky plenum had been to send an observer delegation to the IAG Congress to be held in Paris at the end of the same month. Apparently, the original idea had been for each of the sections of the international left opposition to have its own representatives at the meeting. However, it was finally decided to limit the Trotskyist delegations to those of the German section and the International Secretariat of the International Left Opposition. Peter J. Schmidt of the Dutch OSP presided over the Paris meeting. It was agreed among Trotsky, Sneevliet, and Jacob Walker of the SAP to submit a document to the Paris meeting calling for establishment of a new international and setting forth the principles upon which this new international should be formed. The motion was duly introduced, but the resolutions committee of the meeting refused to accept it. As a consequence, the document was finally made public as the, quote, Declaration of the Four on the need for and basis of a new international, end quote. This declaration was signed by E. Bauer of the International Secretariat of the International Left Opposition, J. Schwab, Jakob Walcher of the SAP, Hendrik Sneevliet of the Revolutionary Socialist Party of the Netherlands, and J.P. Schmidt of the Independent Socialist Party of the Netherlands. Two versions of the document were published. The first one, which was probably the version introduced at the Paris conference, was published in La Vérité on September 1st, 1933. The second version, probably reworked by Trotsky, was somewhat more extensive. We shall summarize the principal points of the second version. Point 1 of the declaration called for, quote, break with reformist policy, end quote, and advocated, quote, the revolutionary struggle for power and the establishment of the proletarian dictatorship as the only means for the transformation of the capitalist society into a socialist society, end quote. The second point declared the revolutionary struggle to be international and therefore said that the, quote, said that the signers, quote, categorically reject the theory of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, which undermines the very foundation of proletarian internationalism, end quote. The third point of the document likewise, quote, no less categorically rejected, end quote, the ideas of the left-wing, quote, Austro-Marxist and left reformist, end quote. It proclaimed that, quote, the victorious working class must direct all of its efforts to the extension of the socialist revolution to other countries, end quote. Point 4 presented the Trotskyist analysis of the, quote, degeneration of the Soviet regime and added that the slavish dependence of the sections of the Comintern on the Soviet leadership led in its turn to a new series of grave defeats to bureaucratic degeneration of the theory and practice of the communist parties and to their organizational weakening. More than that, the Comintern proved not only incapable of fulfilling its historic role, but also more and more of an obstacle in the way of the revolutionary movement, end quote. 5 points and 6 argued that the rise to power of Nazism in Germany had shown the inadequacies of both the Social Democrats and the Communists. Point 7 drew a conclusion from this, quote, the position of world capitalism, the frightful crisis that plunged the working masses into unheard of misery, the revolutionary movement of the oppressed colonial masses, the new danger of fascism, the perspective of a new cycle of wars which threatens to destroy the whole human culture. These are the conditions which imperatively demand the welding together of the proletarian vanguard into a new Fourth International, end quote. It added that, quote, the undersigned obligate themselves to direct all their forces to the formation of this international in the shortest possible time, on the firm foundation of the theoretical and strategic principles laid down by Marx and Lenin. Point 8 pledged cooperation, quote, with all the organizations, groups, and factions that are actually developing from reformism or bureaucratic centrism, Stalinism, towards revolutionary Marxist policy, end quote. It added that, quote, the new international could not tolerate any conciliation towards reformism or centrism, end quote. Point 9 declared the Soviet Union to be still a worker state and added that, quote, the new international will inscribe on its banner as one of its most important tasks the defense of the Soviet state from imperialism and internal counter-revolution, end quote. Point 10 proclaimed that, quote, party democracy is a necessary prerequisite for the healthy development of revolutionary proletarian parties on a national as well as international scale. Without freedom of criticism, without election of functionaries from top to bottom, without the control of the apparatus by the rank and file, no truly revolutionary party is possible, end quote. Although recognizing that peculiar circumstances would face illegal parties, it proclaimed that even there, quote, honest information about the party, freedom of criticism, and a real inner unity between the leadership and the party majority, end quote, were required. It concluded that, quote, the new international, as well as the parties adhering hereto, must build their entire inner life on the basis of democratic centralism, end quote. Point 11 noted that the signers had created a, quote, permanent commission of delegates representatives, end quote, to lay the groundwork for the establishment of the new international. Working shortly after the LAG conference, Trotsky professed himself pleased with the results of that meeting. He declared them, quote, on balance favorable to the left opposition, end quote. Writing in the International Bulletin of the Left Communist Opposition, however, he noted that, quote, the Declaration of the Four was the only serious result of the Paris Conference, end quote. He also observed that representatives of the organization which had signed that declaration had taken different positions on certain issues at the conference, but counseled his followers to have patience, saying that, quote, we conserve our entire right not only to appear under our own banner, but also openly to give our opinion to our allies on what we consider errors on their part, end quote. The effort to hold together the four groups which had signed the declaration were doomed to fail. This became clear, if it was not already so, in the, quote, pre-conference of the Four, end quote, held on December 30th, 1933, in the apartment of Dr. Weil, father of Simone Weil, in Paris. Those present were Bauer, Trotsky, Perosi, Pierre Franck, Pierre Neville, Leon Sedov, and the Internationalist Communist League. And Leon Sedov for the International Communist League, Hendrik Snevliet for the Dutch RSP, Jacques Descartes for the Dutch OSP, Jacob Walcher and Boris Goldenberg for the German SAP. The minutes of that session indicate that there were very sharp exchanges between Trotsky and both Walcher and Descartes. Trotsky accused the SAP and OSP of backsliding and of wanting to maintain a foot both in the camp of the Four and that of the London Bureau. For his part, Walcher accused Trotskyists of the, quote, same sectarian and sterile methods well known to be theirs, end quote. He claimed that, quote, we cannot admit the question being posed in the form, London Bureau or Block of Four, end quote. Descartes was apparently even more vehement. He said that, quote, the left opposition only wishes to get its principles accepted on an international basis, and it considers the Fourth International as only an enlarged LCI, end quote. He added that, quote, there is within the new international a different international, LCI plus RSP. This would be an impossible situation if we quickly construct the new international, end quote. Boris Goldenberg has summed up some of his memories of this meeting. Quote, the topic under discussion was the formation of a new international. I remember Walcher telling Trotsky, A, that a new, quote, international, end quote, could not be formed on the basis of a defeat, that by Hitler, B, nor as a union of sects under the leadership and total hegemony of a historical leader like Trotsky, who inevitably would dominate the scene. Trotsky required that we, SAP and others, separate ourselves from centrist and reformist parties like the Norwegian one, to which Walcher and I contested that this would mean to break off relations with the only proletarian mass party collaborating with us. So nothing came for the moment of the plan to create the Fourth International with us. By, quote, us, end quote, is meant here the SAP and the Dutch Descartes group, not the other members of the London, quote, International, end quote, considered by Trotsky as centrist and reformist. The Block of Four soon, end quote. That was Boris Goldenberg. The Block of Four soon broke up. The German SAP had little more to do with the Trotskyists. Although Snevliet's party had joined... I gotta figure out how to say that guy's name. Sorry.
Snevliet. Snevliet.
Snevliet.
Snevliet.
Snevliet. Although Snevliet's party had joined the international left opposition in September 1933, it was March 1935 before it merged with the OSP to form the Revolutionary Socialist Labour Party, the RSAP. Subsequently, the RSAP broke with Trotsky and never became a part of the Fourth International, nor did any of the other groups which Trotsky had hoped to attract to the movement for the Fourth International finally evolve in that direction. He had at one time had particular hope for attracting the Swedish Communist Party of Kilbom and the British Independent Labour Party. The International Youth Bureau. In February 1934, an effort was made to establish an international organization of those youth groups which were committed to the establishment of the Fourth International. This took place at a conference The delegates to which first gathered in Amsterdam at the Red Lion Hotel. Among the guests at the hotel were a number of heavy-set men who were police agents, although the conference delegates did not at first recognize them as such. These gentlemen took notes on overheard telephone conversations and private discussions on which they were able to eavesdrop. They found out that the conference was going to convene in a town outside Amsterdam and sent word of this to higher police authorities. The Trotskyists had about 15 delegates to this conference and were the largest single group. They included people from the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany in exile, among others. There were also representatives from IAG affiliates, including the British Independent Labour Party, Norwegian and Swedish groups, and the German SAP. Soon after arriving in Amsterdam, the American Albert Glotzer and Walter Held, Heinz EPE, both Trotskyists, sought to find Willy Brandt, who was an SAP delegate. They were first told that he was not there, but when they insisted, they were told that he was busy at a meeting. That made Glotzer and Held a little suspicious, and they discovered later that their suspicions were justified. When the conference opened in the provincial town, the Trotskyists found that they were being excluded from any influence in the meeting. None of them was elected to the presidium of the conference, none was elected to the major committees. When Glotzer got up to protest, the police moved in and said the meeting was over and they were all under arrest. 4 Germans among those arrested were put across the German border by the mayor of the Dutch town. The others were put in a comfortable jail and then were deported to Belgium. The Americans were put on a milk train to Antwerp, whence they went to Brussels. In Amsterdam, the Amsterdam jail, Held, Glotzer, and Willy Brandt had agreed to reassemble the conference in Brussels, although giving out word that they would meet in Luxembourg. When they got to Brussels, the local Trotskyists suggested that they meet in a restaurant in front of the city police headquarters. There on the second floor, they had held a day-long meeting. The big argument at the meeting concerned the formation of a new international. The Trotskyists pushed for a declaration in favor of the Fourth International, but the non-Trotskyists opposed this and a compromise was reached, the call being for a new international. Subsequently, Trotsky strongly attacked Walter Held for agreeing to this compromise. It was agreed that the new International Bureau of Revolutionary Youth Organizations would have its headquarters in Stockholm. The Youth Bureau was short-lived and it was deadlocked between the Trotskyists, who continued to insist on its working for establishment of the Fourth International, and the SAP representatives and others who opposed this idea. The Youth Bureau sent Willy Brandt as a delegate to a conference of the IAG in Paris in February 1935, and he denounced Hendrik Snelliet and P.J. Schmidt, the Dutch delegates, for their support of the idea of the Fourth International. In August 1935, Brandt and his allies expelled Walter Held from the Bureau, which went out of existence soon thereafter. The Internationalist Communist League and the French Turn. The Bloc of Four clearly failed as a device to bring together the various parties and groups which had been alienated from the Second and Third Internationals, so as to form a new Fourth International with a Trotskyist program. The fact was that the Trotskyists remained largely isolated from organized labor and the movement for social change in the handful of countries in which, during its first half-decade, international Trotskyism had been able to establish a foothold. With the possible exception of its Dutch affiliate, the movement consisted of small agitational groups, largely made up of intellectuals with very limited contacts with the working class, whose vanguard they aspired to become. This led Trotsky to propose another strategy, the so-called French Turn. Although he certainly could not foresee this, Leon Trotsky's recommendation to his French followers in June 1934 was to raise an issue which would plague the international Trotskyist movement for the next half-century: the entry of Trotskyists into the ranks of the mass workers' parties, to try to recruit there enough followers to convert their own organizations into, quote, mass, end quote, groups, or if exceptionally lucky, even to seize control of the groups which they entered and to convert them into mass revolutionary parties. Trotsky first proposed entry into the Socialist Party to the Ligue Communiste Internationaliste of France in June 1934. The idea met with resistance but was accepted by most French Trotskyists. Subsequently, the same strategy was applied in Belgium and the United States. However, Trotsky apparently met great opposition to making the French turn into a general policy of the international Trotskyist movement. The issue arose at an enlarged plenum of the International Communist League in October 1934. According to Rudolf Prager, the resolution endorsing the new policy of the French League, quote, obtained a small majority on the condition that the turn be limited to France, end quote. That the turn be limited to France, end quote. The resolution of the October 1934 plenum started with the familiar recitation of the, quote, degeneration, end quote, of the Comintern and a short account of the transformation of the Trotskyist movement from a, quote, opposition, end quote, to a group seeking to establish a fourth international. It then sketched the supposedly new situation within the socialist parties, that is, the tendency toward polarization within them between right and left, and the fact that the impact of events had forced some of them to assume revolutionary positions, a situation of which advantage could be taken. The resolution then contained a passage which, in view of subsequent history, one might find curious. It reads, quote, the psychology, ideas, customs usually lag behind developments of objective relations in society and in the class. Even in the revolutionary organizations, the dead lay their hands upon the living. The preparatory period of propaganda has given us the cadres without which we could not make one step forward. But the same period has, as a heritage, permitted the expression within the organization of extremely abstract concepts of the construction of a new party and a new international. In their chemically pure form, these conceptions are expressed in the most complete manner by the dead sect of Bordigists, who hope that the proletarian vanguard will convince itself, by means of a hardly readable literature, of the correctness of their position, and sooner or later will correctly gather around their sect, end quote. The resolution discussed various objections to the move of the French Trotskyists. It then said that the, quote, plenum notes that the position openly taken by the Bolshevik-Leninist group within the SFIO has nothing in common with capitulation, but represents the application of the principles and methods of the ICL in its new orientation and under new conditions, end quote. The resolution ended with a hint that the French turn might have a wider application beyond France. It said, quote, the plenum orders the IS to regularly furnish materials to all sections, illustrating the work of the French section in the new situation, in order that the ICL as a whole may utilize the experiences thus acquired, end quote. The 1936 First International Conference of the Fourth International The policy of entrism somewhat expanded the forces of the Trotskyists in a few countries, notably Belgium and the United States. Its first effects in France were also positive, although subsequent internecine conflict among the French Trotskyists resulted in the loss of much of the ground they had gained. Meanwhile, the work for the establishment of a fourth international went on. Clearly, Trotsky spent much of his time and attention on this effort. He was even concerned with the minutiae of the proposed new organization. Thus, he sent to the International Secretariat in July 1935 a curious letter discussing the appropriate name for the new organization. He ruled out the plain title Fourth International on the grounds that, quote, it is a number, not a name, end quote, and similarly excluded, quote, socialist and, quote, communist for the title because they had been, quote, much compromised, end quote. Trotsky finally suggested World Party of the Socialist Revolution and proposed that be appended to the name of each national group, giving the example, quote, Workers' Party of the United States, American section of the World Party of the Socialist Revolution, end quote. In August 1935, a new, quote, open letter to revolutionary organizations for the Fourth International, end quote, was issued. Written by Trotsky just before leaving France for his stay in Norway, this document, which was a new appeal to rally all groups and individuals who favored a new international, met some resistance, particularly among the French Trotskyists, who feared that it might embarrass their work within the Socialist Party. However, it was finally issued and published by La Vérité on August 23, 1935. Excuse me. The open letter was signed on behalf of the Dutch RSAP by Hendrik Snevliet and J. P. Schmidt, for the Workers' Party of the United States by James P. Cannon and A. J. Must, for the Workers' Party of Canada by J. MacDonald and Maurice Spector, and by the Bolshevik-Leninist group of the SFIO, no names indicated. For the International Secretariat, the document bore the signatures of Crux, Leon Trotsky, Martin, Alfonso Leonetti, and Dubois, Ruth Fisher. The next step towards establishing, I guess it's Ruth Fisher, that's how you'd say it in German. The next step towards establishing the Fourth International was a conference which met in Paris July 26 to 31st, 1936, although it was reported as meeting in Geneva. Trotsky had wanted it to be the founding Congress of the new international. However, in the face of resistance, he accepted a compromise according to which it was declared that the meeting launched a new group, the Movement for the Fourth International, into which the Internationalist Communist League was being merged. According to the official announcement of the International Secretariat, this 1936 conference was attended by 4 French delegates, 2 from the PCI and 2 from the Youth, 1 from the Dutch RSAP, 2 delegates and 2 observers from Great Britain, 2 from the German IDK, and 1 Italian. There were also representatives of the Soviet Bolshevik-Leninists, representatives of the International Secretariat and the International Youth Secretary, as well as 2, quote, observers, end quote, from the United States. Since the U.S. Trotskyists had recently entered the Socialist Party, they could not appear at this meeting as, quote, official, end quote, delegates. Other groups which were not able to send delegates for financial reasons included those of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Poland, Romania, and Switzerland. Long distances and, quote, the need to limit the conference for reasons of legality to a minimum of delegates, end quote, were responsible for the fact that no one had been invited from Bulgaria, Denmark, Spain, Lithuania, a number of Latin American countries, China, Indochina, Australia, and South Africa. The conference adopted a considerable number of resolutions, both programmatic and organizational. One of the latter was in approval of the move of the French section in expelling Raymond Molinier. Another established a framework for the new movement for the Fourth International, including an international conference as the supreme authority, with a general council, to be in charge between conferences and to meet at least once a year, and an international secretariat to carry on day-to-day activities. Still, another resolution endorsed the move of the U.S. Trotskyists to enter the Socialist Party. Trotsky wrote 3 of the programmatic documents adopted at the 1936 conference. These were the resolution on, quote, the new revolutionary upsurge and the tasks of the Fourth International, end quote, the Fourth International and the Soviet Union, end quote, and, quote, to the public opinion of the workers of the whole world, an appeal for the Russian revolutionists, end quote. The resolution on the new revolutionary upsurge pictured the existence of a pre-revolutionary situation which was going to be resolved in favor of either socialism or fascism, it asserted that, quote, the sections of the Fourth International clearly and distinctly see this danger. They teach the vanguard to organize itself and to prepare, end quote. This resolution also claimed that, quote, not a single revolutionary grouping in world history has yet experienced such terrible pressure as the grouping of the Fourth International, end quote. They were subject not only to the persecution of the elements of the status quo, but also to that of the Stalinist bureaucracy, both in the USSR and in the Comintern. However, the resolution argued the future lay with international Trotskyism. It proclaimed that the, quote, organizations of the revolutionary vanguard will cease to be isolated. The slogans of Bolshevism will become the slogans of the masses. The coming epoch will be the epoch of the Fourth International. Probably the most, end quote. Probably the most crucial document adopted at the 1936 conference was that on the, quote, Fourth International in the Soviet Union, end quote. It put forth the position which was to be Trotskyist orthodoxy for the next half-century. This document was almost strident in its denunciation of the Stalinist regime in the USSR. It argued that, quote, inequality is growing with 7-league strides, end quote, and that, quote, Soviet bureaucracy has acquired an actual independence from the toilers, end quote. The resolution also accused the Stalinist regime of beginning to, quote, reestablish and glorify the petty bourgeois family, that fostering soil of all species of social idiocy, end quote. It argued that, quote, state coercion is not attenuated, but on the contrary, state coercion acquires an exceptionally concentrated, open, and cynical character, end quote, and that the Communist Party, quote, is independent both of the people and of its own members, and represents a political machine of the ruling caste, end quote. However, the resolution did not accept the idea that the bureaucracy has become a new ruling class in a Marxist sense. This resolution summed up the situation by saying that, quote, the working class of the USSR has been robbed of the last possibility of legal reformation of the state. The struggle against the bureaucracy necessarily becomes a revolutionary struggle, end quote. In spite of these bitter denunciations of the Stalin regime, the resolution drawn up by Trotsky and adopted by the 1936 conference argued that, quote, it remains a fact of decisive significance, however, that all the social relationships of the USSR In spite of these bitter denunciations of the Stalin regime to the resolution drawn up by Trotsky and adopted by the 1936 conference, argued that, quote, it remains a fact of decisive significance, however, that all the social relationships of the USSR, the privileges of the Soviet aristocracy included, have themselves in the long run on state and kolkhoz property acquired by the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, which, in distinction from capitalist property, opens up the possibility of the growth of industry and of culture. The historical gulf dug by the October Revolution still continues to separate the Soviet state-planned economy from capitalist, quote, statism, end quote, Trotsky. The resolution defined the kind of revolution which was required in the USSR. It argued that, quote, if a social counter-revolution, i.e. the overthrow of state ownership of the means of production and of the land as well as the reestablishment of private property, is necessary for the return of the USSR to capitalism, then for the further development of socialism, a political revolution has become inevitable, i.e. the violent overthrow of the political rule of the degenerated bureaucracy while maintaining the property relations established by the October Revolution, end quote. It concluded that, quote, the proletarian vanguard of the USSR, basing itself upon the toiling masses of the whole country, and upon the revolutionary movement of the whole world, will have to batter down the bureaucracy by force, restore Soviet democracy, eliminate the enormous privileges, and assure a genuine advance to socialist equality, end quote. However, in spite of the strong condemnation of the Stalinist regime and the call for a political revolution against it, Trotsky in the 1936 conference pledged support to the USSR against all contenders. The resolution stated that, quote, the proletarian vanguard of the entire world will support the USSR in war in spite of the parasitic bureaucracy and the uncrowned negus in the Kremlin, because the social regime in the USSR, despite all its deformations and ulcers, represents an enormous historical step forward in comparison with the putrefied capitalism, end quote. The third resolution, prepared by Trotsky and adopted by the 1936 conference, quote, to the public opinion of the workers and the whole world, end quote, elaborated further on the situation in the USSR. It started by observing that the, quote, question of the fate of the Soviet Union is close to the heart of every thinking worker. 170 million hundred beings are carrying out the greatest experiment in social emancipation in history. The destruction of the new regime would signify a terrible blow to the development of the whole of mankind. But precisely for this reason, the necessity arises for an honest, i.e., critical attitude toward all these complex processes and contradictory phenomena which are to be observed in the life of the Soviet Union, end quote. The resolution then went on with a detailed critique of the latest events in the USSR, particularly the introduction of the, quote, Stalinist, end quote, constitution. This July 1936 Paris meeting was the last full-fledged gathering of the International Trotskyist movement before the conference which formally founded the Fourth International.